Yes.
All right, should we start?
Sure, I'll start anytime.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Erfan Ghiasi. I'm the curator of the show Within the Finitude. It's a group show that opened last night in the Keynote building in Tehran. As someone who's been studying object-oriented ontology for some years, and someone whose artistic and theoretical practice has been significantly influenced by this contemporary school of thought, the footprints of OOO is evident in the exhibition as well. For this reason, I decided to invite Graham Harman, who's one of the most prominent figures of the speculative realism movement, and as Slavoj Žižek put it in his lecture, the star of object orientation in contemporary philosophy. I saw your video, and I saw the post that you posted the other day on Slavoj Žižek, and he said that, yeah. So I thought I have to put it here. Yeah. For this reason, I decided I want to extend my sincere thanks and gratitude to today's lecturer, Professor Graham Harman. He's a distinguished professor of philosophy at SCIARC in Los Angeles and a faculty member at the European Graduate School. He also has taught at the University of Amsterdam, University of Turin, and Yale University. He is editor-in-chief of the journal Open Philosophy, editor of a speculative realism series at Edinburgh University Press, and co-editor with Bruno Latour of the new metaphysics series at Open Humanities Press. There is a possibility that some of you may have encountered the thoughts of Graham Harman through his books and articles on metaphysics and aesthetics. He has already published 20 books, including Art and Objects, E-Materialism, The Quadruple Object, which is my favorite, Guerrilla Metaphysics, Prince of Networks, and also his famous article, The Third Table, that was published in Documenta's catalog in 2012. His forthcoming books within the next year are also Skirmishes, Architecture and Objects, and Artful Objects. He's an amazing writer who expounds his complex ideas explicitly. Harman's world is out of reach, mysterious, and as he expresses it, weird. For him, things that we encounter are not the reality of them, but rather shadows, distortion, and abstractions. His work on the metaphysics of objects led the development of object-oriented philosophy, or what is subsequently known to us as object-oriented ontology, which is an umbrella term coined by Liv O'Brien that includes a variety of philosophers and thinkers and central figures in continental philosophy, such as Tim Morton, Liv O'Brien, Ian Bogost, and of course, Graham Harman. I'm delighted to have him with us today to discuss object-oriented ontology and its implications for the arts. Having said that, there will also be an opportunity for your questions at the end of the lecture. Without further ado, please welcome Graham Harman. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Erfan. I really appreciate that you arranged this. And I also wanted to tell your friends in Tehran that I am grateful to you also for asking one of the more challenging questions I've had in the last few years. When Erfan came to Los Angeles, we met in a, do you call them shisha or nargile or hookah in Iran?
Hookah, yeah.
We met at a hookah cafe.
Actually, but hookah.
Met at a hookah cafe in Los Angeles. It's a bad habit I picked up in Cairo when I was in Egypt. And he asked, how would symbiosis in my book, Immaterialism, be read in terms of the fourfold? And I had simply never thought of that before. And I was very happy he brought that up, and I owe him an answer. But it's such a big question, it's going to need a book of its own, I think. You'll get an answer at some point in the next few years.
Thank you so much. I'm waiting for it. And also,
right.
We met at that was Heidegger's birthday, so that made it special.
Oh, it was Heidegger's birthday.
Okay. Yes.
Wonderful. And that's September 26th.
Mm-hmm.
That's also appropriate because I've been told some of the audience tonight has had more contact with OOO than others. OOO standing for Object-Oriented Ontology, 3 O's, OOO, or OOO as I call it. Some of you are more pro-OOO or more anti-OOO. And so what I'm going to do is, and I was asked to talk about the relation of OOO to arts. And so I will be approaching this from several different directions to give you several different chances to get it. So I think first I'll talk a little about Heidegger, who's someone that many of the audience members are probably familiar with. Then I'm going to talk about my article, The Third Table. Then I will talk about formalism in the arts, theory of metaphor, and I will end with a few words on architecture, since I teach at an architecture school now, and explain how that's shaping my thinking. I don't usually start with Heidegger anymore. And early in my career, I started everything with Heidegger because it was a certain interpretation of Heidegger that my career began. Any reader of Being in Time will remember the tool analysis, the famous tool analysis, which can be interpreted as Heidegger taking a distance from Edmund Husserl's phenomenology. Right? That Husserl thinks we should bracket all questions of the real world or of scientific discovery and simply describe the world as we see it very, very exactly. And my reaction to that is that ends up in idealism, despite people trying to defend Husserl from the charge of idealism. But I'm going to come back and show why he received a very important result from that idealism. Let's start with Heidegger's critique, which is the idea that most of the things we encounter are not present to consciousness. That's actually very rare. The number of things about which you are not thinking right now is much greater than the things you are thinking about, like the chair I'm sitting in, or the stable ground in Los Angeles. We could have an earthquake at any time. Every day there's a 1 in 20,000 chance of a disastrous earthquake here. If that happens, I will suddenly be grateful for the solid ground I have now. This is where he talks about how tools tend to remain unnoticed until they malfunction or break. So the hammer, you're not noticing it. You're noticing the building you're constructing with the hammer, unless it's too heavy or unless it breaks. Now, so it creates this duality between what is present at hand and what is ready to hand. And I simply took that analysis and extended it in several different directions. One of them is by saying, it's not just about tools, right? It also includes, say, human beings, which are supposed to be different from tools. Also with human beings, there is something in the person's personality that withdraws from direct access. You see their actions, you see their facial expressions, you hear their speech, but they are not simply the sum total of all of those. There's something deeper than that, and I like psychoanalysis enough to think the unconscious is part of it. So there's something there that is never fully expressed in the current moment. Now, one thing that I think Heidegger gets wrong, actually there are two things. One of them is he turns that world of tools into a system, right? He says that the hammer refers to the house refers to your wanting to keep dry and warm, that refers to your own existence because you want your existence to be healthy and successful and so forth. So all tools make a system for Heidegger that link together in our Dasein, our human being, as being the source of the meaning of all these tools. Okay, the reason I decided it cannot be systematic is because tools can break. That's Heidegger's other insight. The tools can go wrong. Well, they couldn't go wrong if they were nothing more than their relation to all the other things, because those relations are all working right now, which means if they're going to break in the future, there must be something in each individual tool that is a surplus, that is something not inscribed in the system of relations between the tools. Each tool has an individuality. And this is where I get my concept of real objects. The real object is the one that it's similar to Kant's thing in itself. It cannot be known. You can deduce that it's there. It cannot be known. The main difference from Kant is that for Kant, the thing in itself is something that's simply an excess beyond human access. Whereas for O, we also talk about inanimate relations. When one object smashes another, they also don't fully deploy each other's reality. They're only making contact with the surface of each other, even if they destroy each other. An object cannot make contact with another object any more than I can make contact with an object. Finitude is not just a human burden. Finitude is there even in physical reality. And so we need a more cosmological approach to philosophy than you get in Kant, where it's all about the human world relation. We need to expand it more to the map that Whitehead has, where everything is being considered, except that Alfred North Whitehead tends to reduce things to their relations with other things, whereas I think each thing is a surplus beyond its relations, which is what allows change to happen. So it's a little closer to Aristotle's substance, except that I don't think a thing needs to be natural to be a substance. I want to consider Zoom or an airplane or the Apple Computer Corporation or the United States or the European Union also as entities, just as real as ones in nature. Okay, so that's what I get out of Heidegger. But there's something that Husserl found, despite his idealism, that Heidegger doesn't understand, which is that even when you limit yourself to the phenomenological sphere, just to what we can see, there is a difference between the object and its qualities. David Hume thought an object was nothing but a bundle of qualities. You never saw an apple, you only saw red and round and juicy and solid and cold and hard, and that there's not really an object over and above those qualities. Whereas Husserl maybe is the first in the history of philosophy to discover, no, there's actually an object over and above those qualities. And the proof is that the qualities are constantly changing in our experience, and yet we still see it as the same apple, whether we're looking at different sides of it, or the sunlight is changing, or it tastes different. We take a bite of it and then we drink orange juice and take a bite of it, so it tastes different. The qualities of the apple are always changing, and yet it's still the same apple. Okay, so there's this conflict or strife in Husserl's phenomenological world between the object and its qualities. Heidegger discovers the real object, which is at a deeper level. And then thanks to Leibniz, we know that every real object has to have its own real qualities. Otherwise, all objects will be the same. He says every monad is unified, but it also has its own distinct group of qualities. And so we have a fourfold structure, which I end up linking with Heidegger's own fourfold. I won't go through that tonight. And that's in the book, The Quadruple Object, if you want to see that. So that's the first way I would explain what triple O is all about. It's about studying the tensions between the four poles of the fourfolds. An object only has a loose relation with its qualities, not a tight relation. An object sort of owns its qualities and sort of doesn't, because it can lose them and gain some different ones, but it's still sort of the same object within certain limits. So that's the whole point of the fourfold structure, is that triple O method is about driving a wedge between those links in the fourfold. There are four different object quality links, because you have two different kinds of objects, two different kinds of qualities. And so there are four different possible combinations between the two objects, two qualities. And our method involves driving a wedge between those to try to show their independence and what consequences that independence has. So that's the Heideggerian approach to triple O. Let me now switch to the third table, which is an article that Erfan suggested I talk about. This was written for Documento, so it was written in an arts context. There I'm talking about Sir Arthur Stanley Eddington, whose name I will type in chat. British physicist, flourished around the period of World War I. And Eddington is physicist singular, sorry. Eddington is best known for his experiments verifying Einstein's general relativity. So Einstein's idea is that space and time are curved by gravity. Mass curves space and time. And one of the implications of this theory was that starlight should be deflected by the sun. The gravity of the sun, since it's bending space, should also be bending the starlight from the position where we know the star is. So the star should look to be in the wrong place as it passes the sun. Of course, the problem is we usually can't see stars near the sun because the sun is too bright. So what you have to do is wait for a solar eclipse where the sky becomes dark and the sun is covered by the moon, so you can see the stars also. And I've experienced one solar eclipse in Egypt in 2006, and when you ever get the chance, don't miss it. It's one of the most phenomenal things you can see on this earth, to see that happen to the sun. Animals go crazy, right? Cows turn around and go home. Birds start flying in a confused way. You can see why this terrified ancient people so much. It's really an experience. Anyway, Eddington did this. There were simultaneous observations off the coast of Africa and off the coast of Brazil, I believe. And then he took photographs and he simply measured the deflection of the starlight, and he found that it fit Einstein's theory perfectly. And so that's when Einstein became a household name. He was known among physicists before that for special relativity and E equals mc squared and his explanation of Brownian motion through atoms. But he became a household name when Eddington came to the Royal Society in London and announced his observation proved Einstein is right. And so the headline in the London Times said, "New theory of physics, Newton is overthrown." 1919 or 20, I think it was 1919. So anyway, that's what he's most famous for. But he's also also famous, and used to be even more famous, for his Gifford lectures, which are an annual series of lectures given in Scotland by a leading intellectual. Bruno Latour has done these. Bergson did them. William James, Hannah Arendt, quite a number of famous philosophers have been invited to give Gifford lectures, also scientists. They invited Eddington to Scotland to give his Gifford lectures, and he began the introduction to these lectures say, "I'm sitting here writing my lectures at this table, but it's actually two tables. It's not one. One table is the table we know from everyday life, right? It has a certain solidity and a certain shape and usage, and I have all these objects on it. You don't want to know how many objects I have. Thousands of objects I have on this table. It has a certain price. I bought it at a certain place, certain color. That's the table of practical life. And the second table, which is the one Eddington prefers since he's a physicist, is the scientific table. The scientific table is mostly empty space. You know, the nucleus of an atom is very tiny. It's like the sun compared to the solar system. It's very tiny. And then you've got electrons going around the nucleus. like around the sun. And so this table is mostly illusory. It's mostly empty space. And that's what scientists tell us. And Eddington says, I'll never get you to stop believing in the first table, the table of everyday life. In a way, you have to say both tables are real. And in modern analytic philosophy, we've got this with Wilfrid Sellars and the manifest image and the scientific image, where he says that these two images, the scientific image is better, but you can't really get rid of either of one of them. Science is, no matter how much science you do, you're still going to see the manifest world and act as if you're in it. Well, it occurred to me while writing this article, or just before writing this article, that neither of those is the real table. The real table is something irreducible to both of those, and I'll explain why. I often talk about how philosophy needs to avoid reduction, but there are two kinds of reductions. The most familiar one is the kind we call undermining, which is a real English word, which means when you're trying to sabotage something by digging beneath it, like an enemy's wall at a castle, you dig under it, that's undermining, and the wall collapses. But it's also used figuratively to sabotage a person's goals, undermining them by making it harder for them to do it. Well, undermining is how philosophy started. If you think of Western philosophy as starting with the pre-Socratics, by the way, I'm teaching all Iranian philosophers right now because I've been teaching Arazi, Farabi, Ibn Sina, Ghazali. We'll be doing Sohrawardi at the end of because I'm teaching philosophy in the Muslim world, and I have some familiarity with all these figures. Beginning with the pre-Socratics, they're trying to say that what's real, what's mostly real, the ultimate elements like water, air, earth, fire, and water mixed, or atoms, or the aperon, the large thing that never, it's a kind of a featureless blob that everything passes back into. The problem with undermining is what we call emergence, right? So that if you say that water is H2O, two hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom, that's chemically true, but it doesn't allow us to account for all the properties of water. Namely, that water puts out fire, even though hydrogen and oxygen make fire stronger. But put them together and they quench fire. It's a strange thing. And there are all kinds of things like that in the world of chemistry. Chemists are more attuned to emergence than anybody, more than physicists generally are, because chemists know that when you put things together, you get different kinds of substances. And that by taking organic chemicals made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, you can get organic life forms or even diamonds and so forth. So this is something chemists already know a lot about. And a lot of philosophers know about this, right? Some philosophers are anti-emergence, but many philosophers are pro-emergence and account for this. But the point is, when you put two or more things together, sometimes you get something that wasn't there before in the elements. So you can't have Los Angeles by having all the residents of Los Angeles standing naked in a field, right? Because put us all together with clothing and with buildings and with cars and with signs and lights, you're getting Los Angeles. Los Angeles itself cannot be broken down into pieces. They have to have a certain arrangement. So that has something to do with form. I call it emergence. And so the third table cannot be the physical table, right? The table itself is not the physical table because this table is something more than all the atoms, all the protons, neutrons, electrons, all the quarks, all the strings that make up the table. Those do not explain the table. Also, you can take parts off the table and replace them. I could break off one of the legs and buy a new leg and put it on. It's still the same table, more or less. So within certain limits, an object does not need the exact pieces or elements that it has. An object is something more than those pieces and should not be undermined by looking below. Now, the one that people talk about less is the opposite direction, which I call overmining. This is not really a real word in English. It is, but it means something different. It means you're mining a mountain too much, you're taking too many minerals out, and it doesn't have any left. But for me, overmining means you're reducing a thing upward. You're saying there is no object, like Hume. You're saying there is no apple. There's just a bunch of sense impressions that I see directly, and this idea of an apple is a myth. So that's overmining. They're saying you don't need anything behind the perceptions of the qualities of the apple. The problem with that is that nothing could ever change if everything were on the surface, if everything were just its relations, like in Bruno Latour's philosophy, or if everything were just its appearance to the mind, like in Berkeley's philosophy, or Hume's even, in some way. So you need to have something under and beneath the overmining, just as you have something over and above the undermining. You cannot say that this table is the use I'm making of it, in other words. Why? Because I can make many different uses of this. There are many other things this table could be used for. And this particular use is not the only one. It does not exhaust the reality of the table. My relation to the table is different from a cat's relation to the table or someone else's relation to it. So undermining and overmining, they're both important for knowledge, right? That's what you get when you try to find knowledge. There are only two kinds of knowledge that exist. If somebody asks you what something is, you can tell them what it's made of, or you can tell them what it does, right? So if someone asks me, what is Tehran? And I tell them it's the capital of Iran, it's near the mountains, I can tell the history. That's a kind of undermining, and it's useful, right? People can learn about Tehran from undermining, from hearing what all the things are that Tehran is made of, the population and so forth. Okay, now what if I want to overmine Tehran? I can talk about what Tehran does, what its role is in the Iranian economy, the world economy, world politics, it's the state of its relations with other countries. That's how you would overmine Tehran or Iran more generally. And neither of those is going to give you an answer as to what Tehran or Iran are. They're going to help. They're going to help you get a lot of knowledge, but knowledge isn't enough. If you read a book about a city and then go there, you're always going to find it's different from the description. It's not exactly what you expected. The atmosphere is different because a book and even photographs can only give you so much information. So philosophy then, I say, is something outside of knowledge, strictly speaking. Philosophy is not about being another kind of science that's more general. If you think of science, not always, but science very much has to do with the search for knowledge. And knowledge is a literal enterprise, right? When someone wants knowledge about something, they literally want to know what properties or qualities the thing has. Okay, but that's not the only thing about objects. And I use object in the widest sense. There's another aspect to the things that is not literal, because if you explain a thing in terms of its qualities, you're not exhausting the thing. And so there has to be some other way to get at it. This is one thing that artists know, because artists are not primarily producing knowledge. You can get knowledge from an artwork as a byproduct, but that's not primarily what you're doing. Picasso's painting Guernica is not just saying the Spanish Civil War is violent and inhumane. It also conveys that message, but that painting will still be relevant to the arts 500 years from now when no one will remember the Spanish Civil War, and maybe Spain won't exist. Maybe it will be part of Europe. So you cannot reduce an artwork to information about it. There's something else about it that we cannot quite pinpoint yet. And I simply make the case that philosophy in this respect is closer to the arts than it is to the sciences. And the reason for that is philosophy also doesn't give answers or knowledge. If you think about Socrates, it's the easiest way to prove the case. Socrates is always saying, the only thing I know is that I know nothing. I've never been anyone's teacher. He asks for definitions in every dialogue, but he never ends up with a good definition of anything at the end of any dialogue. He's getting closer, but he's never quite getting there. So Socrates, it's philosophia, right? It's not Sophia. It comes from two words in Greek, philosophia, love of wisdom. It's not Sophia, which would be just wisdom. It's an attempt to approach wisdom in some indirect way, which is what Socrates tries to get us to do. And I think that's there in a lot of other important philosophers. Kant obviously has the thing in itself that we can't know. Aristotle's substance, even though Aristotle's substance can be explained in a logos, he also says you can't define a substance because a substance is a concrete individual thing, but definitions are universal. So already for Aristotle, there's a gap. For Plato, there's a gap, right? Because no speech will ever be able to reflect the perfect forms without some kind of transformation. So we find in a lot of philosophers that they are carrying on this insight of Socrates, whereas it's been fashionable for the past 400 years to turn philosophy into a kind of knowledge, a kind of science. And there's been a kind of slavish admiration to the sciences by many philosophers, rather than realizing that we might have something different to offer the world of cognition. There are forms of cognition that are not knowledge. That's what I wanted to say. And I also need to introduce the word duomining, because that's overmining and undermining at the same time. And that's usually what happens. Because if people try to simply undermine or overmine, they realize there's a problem. And so they need the other side as their alibi. So an example would be if physicists say the entire universe is made out of these really, really tiny things, whether it's quarks and electrons, or whether it's strings, or something even smaller than strings, it's something way, way down at the bottom, and everything is built out of that. This whole city is just built out of quarks and electrons. Okay, that's undermining. But then it turns out that these quarks and electrons can be perfectly mathematically modeled, according to the scientists, which is overmining. You're reducing quarks and electrons to what we can know about them mathematically. So again, you're losing something. The third table, or the third anything, is the real thing, and that's in between the undermining and the overmining. It's somewhere in between, but it's not another world like in Plato or even Kant. It's not some eternal perfect world. It's in this world. It's just that we don't have direct access to it in this world. These real things are surrounding us. I'm a real thing, you're a real thing too, real object. But they're here, but we can't quite translate them into terms of speech or terms of prose, literal words. We cannot do that. There's always going to have to be an indirect way to do that. And this is why the arts talk about things obliquely. Philosophy often has to use myth or metaphor to talk about what it's getting at. So maybe that'll be enough for that point. That was I started with Heidegger. Now I did the essay, The Third Table. Now I want to talk a little bit about formalism in the arts, which is out of fashion in the Western world since the 1960s, probably since Andy Warhol did his first pop art. And you had minimalism and op art, which is optical art. And people have been pretty much against formalism since 1963, let's say. So it's been about 60 years. Now, formalism, I think the best place to trace the word back to is to Kant, even though Kant only uses the word formalism for his ethics. I don't remember him using it either in the Critique of Pure Reason or the Critique of Judgment. It's still relevant there, but he uses it in the Critique of Practical Reason. Formalism in ethics, of course, is that an ethical act must be completely self-contained for Kant. It can't be judged by its consequences, can't be judged by how it makes you feel or whether it gives you a good reputation, or if you do something because you want to go to heaven instead of hell, there may be a benefit to society from that. But that doesn't make it an ethical action. It's an action done out of religious motivation more than out of purely ethical motivation. If you do something, if you give money to a homeless person because you don't want to feel guilty, that might be good, but it's not an ethical action. It's an action taken so that you don't feel guilty or so that you feel happy. So for Kant, it has to be done purely for its own sake. It has to be done without an extreme amount of pleasure. It's supposed to be done simply because it is the right thing to do it. That is what ethics is. So that's his ethical formalism. Max Scheler made what I think is the most interesting critique of ethical formalism, which is he said Kant is right that actions shouldn't be judged by their consequences or their effects. But he says ethics isn't just about me, and it's not universal. Ethics is about my relation to objects. And he has this essay on this term, ordo amoris in Latin, which means the ordering of loves, the ordering of passions. Ethics is about having passion for certain things, and that each of us therefore has our own ethical vocation. Each of us has our own ethical mission, because each of us values different things. Doesn't mean we can't be judged. Some people, he says, have a terrible ordo amoris. Some people have defective character, and you can judge them as having a defective character. But beyond that, let's assume all of us are nice people. We are still all ethically very different. We have different concerns. And also, Scheler talks about national ethical vocations, right? If you think of the Italian love for the opera, or the Russians being really good at chess or ballet, for example, or the Iranians being very good at philosophy. If you go back through history, you guys are like the Germans and the ancient Greeks. You produce so many philosophers. Okay, there's something in the Persian soul that has a talent for philosophy, right? We don't know what it is, but it's something. Scheler allows for that, right? That can be certain nations with certain ethical vocations. Okay, let's forget about the Critique of Pure Reason for a second and talk straight about the Critique of Judgment, since I'm supposed to talk about arts. Kant does not use the word formalism there in that book that I can remember, but he is considered the godfather of aesthetic formalism, right? That the formalist art of the 20th century is generally traced back to Kant, because Kant thinks beauty should be known purely by taste, not because of its other significations, like its political meaning, its social meaning, its the fact that that makes me happy, the fact that basically an artwork is not about true or false content. It's not a conceptual thing. It's about the faculty of taste, the faculty of judgment, where you use your taste simply to decide whether something is beautiful or not. And so again, like with ethics, the ethical act is isolated from everything else, closed off. The aesthetic judgment is also closed off from everything else for Kant. And so he's often seen as the person who made it possible, say, for abstract expressionism in the arts, like Jackson Pollock, you guys all know, he liked Cubism the best. I'm sorry, Clement Greenberg. I'm going to get to Clement Greenberg. Kant obviously was dead way before Cubism. So what you get with formalism is you have two great critics, especially in the United States in the 20th century, Clement Greenberg and Michael Fried, who is still alive. And what Greenberg says is that the artwork should again be purely self-contained. He's skeptical of any social political content. He's actually skeptical of any content. He doesn't want a painting to tell a story. He says that's been exhausted. This is why he favors abstract arts, this simple, pure experience of colors and shapes. So he likes Cubism, he likes Mondrian, he likes Juan Miró, he likes Pollock and de Kooning. And that's because he thinks art should be a self-contained thing. It shouldn't be making direct political commentaries on the outside world. It tends to go wrong when it does that. And that's because he thinks all painting is about the flat background canvas. It's not about the surface, the content of the surface. It's about the fact that the background of the painting is a flat canvas. And therefore, all content exists only to kind of signal at its own medium, to signal the fact that I realize I'm a flat painting. And so I'm not going to try to tell a story here with horses and people and kings. I'm just going to put colors and shapes because this is a flat medium. It's not supposed to be three-dimensional like the Italian Renaissance thought all the way up to the 1850s in Europe, where paintings were supposed to be paintings of realistic looking scenes. Greenberg said that's dead. Okay, Fried, Greenberg's one-time disciple before they had a falling out, has a slightly different critique of modernity. He says modernity is too theatrical, or sorry, not modernity, postmodernity. That art since the 1960s is too theatrical. What does that mean? Well, he thinks theatrical art is art that tries to get a certain reaction out of the person seeing it, which he calls the beholder. The beholder is the person experiencing the work. Fried, to this day, hates art that he says is theatrical, and he thought minimalism was theatrical. Because if you come into a room and there's just 6 cubes sitting on the floor in a dark room, you're supposed to find that kind of ominous and frightening, and it's supposed to have an effect on you emotionally. And that's why Fried, like Greenberg, does not like minimalism as an art form. He goes all the way back to France in the 1700s, and he talks about French painting and also about Diderot. Diderot, the encyclopedist, was also a great art critic, believe it or not. And what Diderot and his allies were saying in that time is that art is better when the people depicted in the painting are not looking at us. They're not paying attention to us. It seems like they don't notice that we're watching them. They are absorbed, right? He talks about being absorbed. And that's why these painters in this time in France are doing things like blowing a soap bubble, which takes all their concentration. So they're looking at the soap bubble as it expands and not looking at us. Or another one, they're building a house of cards, which is very hard to do. And so they're focused on that. Or in another, the desk drawer in the painting is pushed out towards us, which seems like it's pushing us away because we're not supposed to be there. Theater is supposed to be kept out of the arts, according to Fried in this period. But then a crazy thing happens. The crazy thing that happens is Fried totally changes his mind over the next 2 books. He realizes it's impossible because a painting cannot exist unless somebody is looking at it, right? You cannot pretend that the figures in the painting are simply ignoring us because the painter painted it because he knows we're going to look at it. And he claims, Fried actually concedes, he didn't like this, but he has to concede that in the 19th century, French painters started realizing this and started acknowledging it. So for Gustave Courbet first, French realist painter, starts painting himself into the paintings. So you can see people in the paintings who actually look like Courbet, or they look like a painter holding a palette, even if it's just a rock that they're holding. And so he says Courbet is starting to break down this wall between the painting and us. And then Manet, Edouard Manet, who is usually considered the first modern painter in Europe, he notices that in Manet, usually one of the figures in the painting is looking right at us. Like if you think of Olympia or Déjeuner sur l'herbe, 2 of his most controversial and famous paintings, the central person, a woman, a naked woman in both cases, is looking right at us. Also, he says the whole surface of the canvas is no longer deep, it's coming up towards us. And so he has to admit there is a kind of theatricality that comes back in. So in the 1700s, he wanted to see an anti-theatricality, which really is there. And I think he wanted to extend that all the way up to the present, but then he realized he couldn't, that painting becomes more theatrical. And then, of course, in the 1960s, it becomes totally theatrical, right? There's performance arts, conceptual arts. happenings where people try to scare you. This is what happens to art from the 1960s onward. Land art, all of this is theatrical. So Freed ends up having to admit that Kant is wrong too, even though Freed seemed to want to create a self-contained artwork just like Kant's. Freed has to realize that art really is about a relation between the beholder and the artwork. And the twist I put on that is to say, my relation to an artwork is itself the art object. An art object is not just the object outside of me, so that I'm a subject and that's an object, but I myself plus the art object create a kind of bond, a theatrical bond, so that that is what art is about. Art is about the new object created out of you and the artwork together, one thing. And so the formalism I recommend is not the kind that Kant, Greenberg, and Freed recommend. What Kant, Greenberg, and Freed mean by formalism is that the human and the non-human must be split. You cannot cross-contaminate the human and the objects. That seems to be the central rule for all three of them for their artwork. The artwork is supposed to be self-contained, my taste is supposed to be self-contained, but you're not supposed to mutually contaminate the two. Whereas I say formalism is all about contaminating, because theatricality is unavoidable in the arts. There has to be a beholder who is theatrically involved. The way it's still formalism is that it's cut off from the rest of the world, right? And the whole world doesn't come to bear on the artwork. You create a microcosm that just contains you and the art object. Even if there's a site-specific object of art or architecture, people like talking about site specificity. This thing is not formalist because it's relating to its environments. Yes, that happens, but it doesn't relate to the whole environment, right? A site-specific sculpture or building is only going to relate to at most 5 or 6 parts of the environment, and it's going to ignore the other parts. And so you expand the art object or architecture object so that it brings in a few things from the outside, but you can never say it brings in everything. And it's just this holistic universe where everything is everything. No, the formalism comes in from the limitation on relations. Right? There are relations in the artwork, but they're limited and they become objects. Okay, and here I'll make my remark about architecture a little earlier than I expected. Kant doesn't like architecture. He doesn't hate it as much as Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer says architecture is as worthless as water fountains. It's just a very, very minor art because it has a use. And for Kant, to have a use for an artwork is a very bad thing. Because that's what his formalism is about, right? Use should be excluded from the artwork. Now, I actually think every period in philosophical aesthetics has taken one form of art to be the ideal form of art. So for Aristotle, Greek tragedy. For Kant, literature is the best art. For Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, it's music. Who else can I say? People are picking different forms of art different times as the ideal kinds. For Roland Barthes, it may be photography. I say architecture is the art genre of our time. Now, why is that? Because our biggest mission right now in aesthetics, I would say, is to overcome the limitations of Kant's perspective. Kant is still very much the latest great. Hegel does some good stuff too, but I think Kant is really the greatest aesthetician we have from the somewhat recent past, 240 years ago. But there's a limit, as I said, to his conception of formalism, which is that he thinks the human and the non-human have to be kept apart. Whereas I'm saying that's a mistake. And architecture is precisely the place where you can't really keep the human and the non-human apart because it's an artwork, but it's also something people have to use. So we need to find a way to think architecture properly if we want to have an aesthetics that can live up to the time today. Oh, I was going to say Deleuze and cinema. That was my other example. Deleuze and his wonderful 2 books on cinema. Or even for that matter, Stanley Cavell has his nice book on cinema. I don't know if he thinks cinema is the #1 art genre, but it's up there. Okay, so how do we approach architecture? I'll just say this very quickly. I don't know how many of you are interested in architecture, but since I teach at an architecture school now, I think about this every day. And I just finished writing a book on architecture. Usually the distinction in architecture is between form and function. That's the major opposition. And there's been a debate about this ever since the Italians rediscovered Vitruvius's work on architecture from the time of the Caesars. Now you've got 2 kinds of people, basically. There's many variants, but you've got formalists and you've got functionalists in architecture. The functionalists, many of the moderns, think the form of the building should follow the function. So there should be very little decoration. You should simply see a very simple building of concrete, steel, and glass without decoration. This is architectural modernism as we know it. That's function. Whereas the formalists are concerned with the look and shape of the building and don't really care about the function. And it even goes so far that Peter Eisenman, one of the leading architects alive today at Yale University, Peter Eisenman actually tries to destroy the functionality of his buildings. So when he built some houses, he put a column down the middle of the dining room and even down the middle of a bed once, which is very inconvenient. But he's very proud of it because he says the people who live in these houses have said very unexpected things have happened as a result of this. But I don't think you actually need to break the functionality to make that happen. I think it's fine to have the house be functional. Here's the problem with form and function. They are both thought of in relational terms, right? Because the form is supposed to be the look of the building, how it looks to people. So it's in relation to us. The function, of course, is also supposed to be in relation to us. What does it do for people? Well, you may know that in medieval European philosophy, there's this idea of substantial forms, which are not the forms of the things that you see, but the forms of the thing that are actually inside the thing, giving it its structure. So it's a hidden form, and you can't see the hidden form directly. And I think that's the kind of form we need to talk about in architecture, not just the visual look, because the form of the building means more than how it looks to a person. I also think we need a non-relational conception of function, and that might seem harder, right? But part of it is that when you're establishing the function of the building, it doesn't need to be tied too closely to any specific function, because many buildings are used for different purposes at different times in their existence. So what's the name of it in Italy where Galileo, Padua, Italy, there's an old building that was, I think, a church, but they've converted it into a kind of factory. And so the building is no longer a church, it's a factory and a place where people sell things, but there's still something about the form that stays, and it's not just its outer appearance. There's something deeper in its form and also in its function. And I call these zero form and zero function. And this is what we need to discover in architecture. What is a form and function in architecture that will be deeper than any way that we look at the building or see it, or any way that we use the building? This is a language we need to invent. And some architects are trying to figure this out right now here at SciArc in Los Angeles. We'll see where it goes. We'll see whether it succeeds or not. So that's my thought about why architecture is important, because architecture is forced to confront Kant's theory in a way that the other arts are not. Right? The other arts can still claim that they are following Kant's principles and being right. Architects cannot do that. If architects accept Kant's aesthetics, they're destined to be nothing but craftsmen. They can't be artists. They're just people making convenient things. They're engineers. So now here's my last approach to this. I wanted to talk about metaphor, and I've written about this a lot. What insight does metaphor give us into artworks? I mean, not every artwork requires a metaphor, but a metaphor is something that gives us some insight into how the art object works. And here I thought about this for many years, because there's a Spanish philosopher from the early 20th century, Jose Ortega y Gasset, who was very big in the heyday of existentialism. Some people have compared him to kind of a clearer Heidegger. There's some similarities between him and Heidegger. Ortega was a wonderful writer. He mostly wrote newspaper articles, so he was able to boil down philosophical ideas to very simple, clear ways of explaining them. And at the age of 30, he wrote a very important article on metaphor that is unlike any of his other writings. And I first read this when I was 19, and for years and years, I was puzzled by how to interpret this article. It took me 18 years, 2005, I think I finally figured out what he was doing in this essay. I wrote about it in Guerrilla Metaphysics, my second book, and I've written about it in a few other books. Ortega also is talking about how literalism is not art. Literalism simply describes the outside of a thing. This, science can never give us a sense of the inner life of a thing. It will tell us the qualities you can see from the outside of a dog or an apple or a chemical. It doesn't tell us what it's really like to be that dog or a chemical or an apple. And so Ortega says, imagine the importance of a language that could make it seem like we are experiencing the inwardness of a thing and not just describing it from the outside. And he says, this is what art does. And he says, the example he gives is he uses the cypress tree and says, the cypress is like a flame. I don't know if you know the cypress tree. I don't know what it's called in Persian, but it looks like a flame. It looks like a small fire. But that's really the only common thing they have, right? That they both look like fires. But when the poet says the cypress is like a flame, or even the cypress is a flame, that's not what he's not just saying the cypress has the same shape as a flame. That's not his point. He's using that as an excuse to link them to in a more absolute way. So now you imagine the cypress as being on fire or as being actively burning things or destroying things. The metaphor allows you to think of the cypress as having flame qualities and not just cypress qualities. Imagine the metaphor were reversed. The flame is like a cypress. Then in that case, the flame is the subject and it has cypress qualities. So it has solidity, it's rooted in the earth, it grows like a tree, we can rest in its shade like a tree. This is what makes a metaphor challenging. So one of the things that's different between metaphor and literal speech is metaphors are irreversible. To say the cypress is like a flame and to say the flame is like a cypress are totally different. But if you say Venice is like Amsterdam because they both have canals, you can also say Amsterdam is like Venice. It makes no difference because literal statements, you're just comparing the qualities and it doesn't matter which word you put first. With the metaphor, you are taking one term as the object and the other term is providing the qualities. Either the cypress has flame qualities or the flame has cypress qualities. That's one thing that makes metaphor different from literal statements. The other thing that makes metaphor different is that it can't, the resemblance cannot be too close or too far away. So instead of the cypress is like a flame, what if I say the cypress is like a juniper, which is another tree that looks a lot like a cypress? That's a botanical statement. That's a scientific statement about how the two trees are related, they're similar. It's not metaphorical. Unless you have some genius poet of Dada who can make it work in a poem, but that's very rare. You'd have to do a lot of work. If I say the cypress is like a cypress tree is like a juniper tree, it's not a metaphor, it's just a true or false statement. What if I say the cypress is like the collected works of Marcel Proust? People are gonna say, what? There's not really enough of a similarity there. You have a tree and you have Proust's collected works. There's no way to put that together. So you need the cypress is like a flame because you can kind of see the similarity. They have kind of a similar shape and that allows the metaphor to work. So the metaphor needs to hit the sweet spots in between the two literal and the two impossible. And that's how it works. And also, again, the metaphor is not reversible. So Homer, great ancient Greek poet Homer, talks about the wine dark sea in the Odyssey. Odysseus is sailing home over the wine dark sea. But again, you could also say the sea dark wine, but that's a different metaphor. The first metaphor you're talking about sea, second metaphor you're talking about wine. So it's a totally different thing. It's not symmetrical, it's not reversible. Okay, so why is this important? Okay, you remember my fourfold diagram, which I can't put in the comment section. You've got a real object, real qualities, and then on top you got sensual object, sensual qualities. In metaphor, what you have is the real object with sensual qualities. Because when he says the cypress is like a flame, you can't really imagine this cypress. It's something magical and other. You can't really get it. A flame like cypress, but the flame qualities are there because you know what a flame is like. You know that it's hot and it's orange and it has a certain shape. And so that's not a problem. The flame qualities are not a problem. The problem is the cypress. And so you get a kind of black hole. The cypress is like a black hole that you can't see, but it's surrounded by flame qualities. And then here's the final step and how O interprets metaphor. For O, there's no such thing as an object without qualities or qualities without an object. They're always together. So if the metaphor, the cypress is like a flame, turns the cypress into a black hole, there's no object there for the flames to attach themselves to. There's this empty space, this void. There's only one real object that the flames can be attached to, and that is I myself, because I myself, as the reader of the poem or the beholder of the artwork, am also a real object. It's not an image of me that's looking at the art, it's really me who is enjoying the art. I'm the only real object there because the cypress has disappeared, it's vanished. It's a real object, it can't be contacted. So it is I, as a real human, who support the qualities of the flame. And that is why art has to be theatrical, I say. Theatricality, I've looked a lot at the Russian director Stanislavski. And he's often famous for what's called method acting in the United States. In Russia, they call it the system. And that is the method where actors really pretend to be what they're playing. So like in acting class, they will say, you are a flame. And then you have to imagine that you're the flame and maybe you do this, you're performing the flame. So the performing arts would be the root of all the arts. And I think one of my pieces of evidence for this is the emotional effect that masks have on us. And not just us, but also on children and on animals. You can scare animals with masks. I inadvertently scared my parents' dogs. I had this crazy zebra mask for Halloween that I bought. It came from Tanzania, and it was really scary. It had these eyes like with smoke around them, and it looked like this evil zebra that was raised from the dead. And when I put that on at my parents' house, the the small terrier and the large black lab started barking at me, even though they know me, they love me. But when I put this zebra head on, they are frightened. And finally, the big dog came and jumped up and knocked the mask off my head. And of course, children think if they put on a Batman mask or a monster mask that they have been transformed and that they can scare you. It's Halloween tomorrow in the United States. We have this holiday where children go out with masks and get free candy. And so it's a big holiday here for kids. Kids love to wear these masks, and it scares people sometimes. Some of them are cute, some of them are scary. So that's why I think theatricality is the root of arts. And then this links up with some other things in philosophy, like speech act theory. There's a difference between performative and constitutive statements. Right? Constitutive statements are the kind where you just give information, like you say, it is not raining right now in Los Angeles. True statement. But a performative statement would be, if it starts to rain in Los Angeles, I promise to run outside in my swimming trunks. And that's not so serious because no one's going to hold me to it, right? Or I can say, if Trump wins the election, I will move to Canada. The only consequence there is people will laugh at me if I don't follow through, right? They'll say, I thought you were going to move to Canada. I'll say, yeah, it's too expensive. I can't do it yet, but I will. But or signing a contract or promising marriage to somebody. These give you a certain responsibility in a way that constitutive statements don't. And I would say the same thing. Metaphor gives you a responsibility in a way that literal statements do not, because you can make a literal statement, it's true or false, but a metaphorical statement, you are not experiencing it unless you are actually performing it, at least in your minds, unless you're actually reading the wine dark sea and imagining and performing that in your mind, that I am actually experiencing this wine dark sea. It doesn't just mean that the sea and the wine are the same color. That's just the first step. The rest of it is you're giving the sea all these other wine qualities like drunkenness, forgetfulness, intoxication, maybe violence, all these other things we associate with wine. So these are 4 different ways I've given: Heidegger, formalism, metaphor, and what's the other one? The third table. 4 different ways you can approach the arts through O. And I hope that gives you some idea of about what it's all about. And we're not quite at an hour yet, but we're pretty close. So maybe I could stop and take questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for your amazing lecture. I really enjoyed it. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was amazing. If anybody has any question, you can chime in. And if you don't, I do.
I shouldn't have just said that Persians were good at philosophy. You're also really good at poetry.
Oh, yeah. We have Hafiz, Ferdowsi, yeah.
And Rumi was actually Persian, even though he was living in Turkey. Where's Turkey today?
Yeah.
So, great tradition.
No, actually, Arman, you have a question? You can unmute. You can click on the.
Right. Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for really simplifying O. I've tried reading it in the past and struggled with it. In 1 hour, you condensed everything, and it was amazing. One of the things that I in the past moved me very much close to what you was talking about was the American artist historian Mitchell once suggested that what do pictures want, and what pictures want is probably simply to ask them, what is it that you want? And in my mind, I always thought that an object-oriented ontology is close to asking objects, actually, what is it that you want? And simply the answer might be, just ask me. I don't have an answer, but the fact that you acknowledge that and you ask me is sufficient for me. Where does that sit with O?
The first thing this made me think of was Lacanian psychoanalysis. Have you done anything with Jacques Lacan? because I was just reading the part in Seminar Book 2 where he says that the ego is an object, because we're actually a subject, which is deeper than our conscious ego. And he always talks about how desire is desire of the other, right? We want to know what the other thing wants, and we want what the other wants. So the first connection that comes to mind is through Lacan rather than through Triple O. But yeah, we can ask what an object wants within Triple O, I guess. We can try to do justice to it in some way by not reducing it to the surface it presents to us. I don't know this work by Mitchell that you meant. Mitchell, what's the first name? It's a common name.
It's William Mitchell. He's
William Mitchell.
at Chicago University, I think. It's an essay that he wrote in 1996. I'll send through the reference. I think I'll put it in the comments.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I would say the way Triple O tries to do it is by trying to approach the object on its own terms, rather than through the way it relates to us. My former teacher, Alfonso Lingus, has tried to make an ethics out of this. He claims that objects demand to be treated in a certain way, and not just humans and animals. That it's wrong to waste valuable things on unimportant occasions. So if you have a delicious, expensive chocolate, it should only be eaten in certain moods, right? It shouldn't be just chomped down as you're walking down the sidewalk. It should be saved for a special occasion, perhaps. Or people who collect really old bottles of wine will save them for a very important moment in their lives. Whereas it might seem wasteful to, Lingus gave the example of one of his former students who went into that beautiful temple in Kyoto, Japan, and snowflakes were falling, and the guy put a Walkman on his ears and was listening to pop music. And Lingus was trying to claim this was ethically wrong. It was a violation of the temple. He wasn't treating the temple with the respect it deserved. It was kind of an insult to Japanese history, he thought. And I could see that case. I can see the case that objects demand a certain treatment. Some of the most beautiful places on earth, it sometimes feels like you should be silent and not chatter about just anything, but just be in a kind of awe in what you're seeing. I can think of a few places that have had that effect on me, where I don't want to hear anybody talk. I just want to be overwhelmed. So that's, I don't know if that's getting at your question, but that's the closest I can approach right now.
Thank you for that. I'll think about it.
Question.
All right, I think Ali has a question.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Graham. It was an amazing lecture. I think my question for you is somewhat a continuation of Arman's question, but by only just turning his question on its head. My question would be, what does Triple O want from us? And by that, if I may, to provide a context in which I can situate the question. When I was first introduced to OOO, my first question was like, what is the necessity for replacing the question of being with the lowercase b, with the object, without falling into the trap of a contemplative vision of the world, a speculative materialism, not a speculative realism, vitalism, and so on, and animating all the objects around the human just to giving emphasis to a form of critique of anthropocentrism and so on. So this question, I even remember I somewhat asked this question to you when you were delivering a lecture actually in 2014 in Vancouver, that what would necessitate that we replace the word being with object?
Right. Okay.
Sorry, in a sense that like, if you understand that like, if you go with more like radical ontologies that like claims that a being is only thinkable insofar as it belongs to a world, not to the world, but to a world as a situation, a mathematical situation. So in a way, a being is only thinkable if we apply the Parmenides axiom that like thinking and being could be the same thing. So in that sense, the ontology would have its emphasis on the logi, not the onto. So the knowledge of being does not entail the knowledge of appearing. So in that sense, there would be some radical implications coming out of that philosophy that, for example, it puts the question on the question of appearance of the objects in a world, rather than what are the objects in a world. Or in a way, if we go with the Cartesian idea that I think, therefore I am, as Alain Badiou puts it, says, I think I am anyway. What do you think of my being? So just to make a subject position or position, if we treat philosophy at the end of the day as a matter of like making a position in this which I would think that if we take philosophy as a form of like dialectical conceptualizations of contradictions of a rule, what does O have to offer as a radical implications either in art or in politics and so on? Sorry, it was a long question, but
no, it's good. And I do enjoy reading Badiou, especially Logics of Worlds, which I enjoy more than being an event. But totally. I think he still gets himself into a certain problem. The problem, as I see it, is that especially since Kant, philosophy has become narrowly focused on a single relation between human and world. Like, how is the transcendental structure of the world allow us to experience? In what ways is the thing in itself withdrawn from us? How can we sort of get at it through ethics or through faith? But object-object relations have disappeared from the sphere of philosophy for the most part, because we assume, oh, science is dealing with that, right? Science can calculate what happens when two things smash together. And which means philosophy is no longer dealing with everything. And the mandate of philosophy is supposed to be dealing with everything, not just be dealing with the transcendental situation that we think we find ourselves in. We need to be able to talk about any kind of relation, because humans ultimately are not that important in the universe, right? And in the ecological situation, we're seeing that humans can affect the world, but we're not the center of the world always, right? The things that happen have a lot to do with the earth and not with us. And so there's an ecological motivation, and also just the motivation of standing up for philosophy and saying there are things we can do for ourselves. It doesn't mean that I think we should replace contemporary science with some kind of crazy German idealist philosophy of nature where magnetism is the... No, I mean, we have to respect what science is doing, but we also have to be able to account for inanimate objects in a specifically philosophical way, or we're not doing our job. Philosophy is not just about the point where human meets worlds. And where I think Badiou gets it wrong is he does treat it as about the place where human meets worlds. When he says that ontology is mathematics, and when all that's behind the inconsistent multiplicity is a void, right? There's not really anything hiding behind the things. Well, the problem with that is that then you're veering towards an idealist position where everything is equivalent to its givenness. And of course, Badiou is getting some of that from Hegel. He's getting some of it from Lacan. Whereas I think we need to go not just to Heidegger, but back to Aristotle, where the substances are certain individualized things that are never fully expressed, and that they have a being of their own, a reality of their own. As for the term object, the reason I use that term is simply to mark my debt to Husserl and Brentano and the other Austrians who kind of laid the way for object-oriented ontology. Brentano, Meinong, Husserl, because they also wanted to talk about all the objects. Obviously, Heidegger uses object as a negative word. He uses thing as a more positive word, but object is an old word. We don't need to follow what Heidegger says. Object in the Austrian sense is what I mean. Anything that there is. Where I differ from the Austrians, where O differs from the Austrians, is they are concerned with the object as something that could be an object of thought. So we can think of a square circle. We can think of the bald king of France. We can think of this desk. But what about these objects themselves? What about not insofar as they're thought, but insofar as they relate to each other? So I'd say these Austrians are, even though they disliked German idealism, they're still stuck within something similar. They can't get out of that human world circle. This is also where I differ from Meillassoux in speculative realism, that he thinks the argument that I can't think of something outside thought without turning into a thought, the correlationist circle, he actually thinks that's a strong argument. People forget this. People just think that Meillassoux uses science to critique correlationism. No, Meillassoux actually thinks the correlationist argument is a strong one. And that's why he has to invent this very indirect detour to get around it. I just don't think it's a good argument to say that I'm thinking something outside thought, therefore it's a thought. No, my thought about it is a thought. It doesn't follow that the thing itself is a thought. And so in other words, we can talk about object-object interactions. We can deduce, just as I deduce that there's something in this coffee cup deeper than my perception of it, I can deduce that there's something on the table deeper than what the coffee cup encounters when it sits on the table. And then you've got a broader philosophy then that it has a mandate to discuss every possible topic and not just topics of human experience. And this is why, as great as the period from Kant through Hegel is, and even the phenomenological period, we need a little more pre-modern influence here, or early modern at least. Right? Like we need some more Leibniz, we need some more Aristotle. And I would say that it's Whitehead who has made this step for us. He made it way ahead of time, where we said thought world is not the only relation. Any two things relate, and all relations are partial. I just don't like the fact that he tends to reduce things to their relations to other things. I don't think he has a strong enough sense of the individual apart from its relations. That was kind of a long answer to your question. I don't know if that's satisfactory or not.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, I don't want to take up so many other people's time. Like, I truly appreciate the critique of Badiou or Ghiasi, specifically Ghiasi, that you have, but still, I have a feeling that, I mean, with all due respect, I may still have some disagreement with you about Badiou, but because I simply think that he gets it, that there is an object-object relationship. He gets it that anthropocentrism or correlationism could simply fall into the trap of stupidity, is a form of stupidity. But I think for philosophy for him, at the end of the day, is a matter of making a position. By the difference between him and Kant is that, like, transcendental for Kant is a subjectivated construction at the end of the day, whereas for Badiou is a immanent given of every singular situation whatsoever. So transcendental for Badiou actually is one and the same thing with logic. Is the same thing with the appearing. So that's why for him the question, beside and beyond that, what are the object-object relations, is that how objects appear in the world, regardless of what they are. So from this, a form of politics could emerge, whether it's a good politics or bad politics. At least something I see would be an implication, a radical implication, with an account of change, with an account of. That's what my question. That is what I know, that object-object relationships have to be thought about. But what are the implications? Putting it as you say, what about the objects? What is the implication that could be utilized and instrumentalized towards a project? Could we think of a radical project with the triple O? That's basically what I meant. Otherwise, I totally get your position.
Okay. I've got three things to say to that. First of all, the reason I don't think objects are thought adequately in Badiou is because they have to be counted, right? An object emerges from, an individual emerges from the count. Now you can argue that it's not just a human count, but even so, that makes it relational. That would make it at best like Whitehead's, where a thing is real when it's detected by some other thing. And then you got the problem of how to get from the inconsistent multiplicity to the consistent multiplicity. I don't see how you can do that. Second thing I wanted to say is I find Badiou stronger on the event than on being. That's why I like Logics of Worlds better. And what does he do? It's his existentialist side, right? He says that there is no event unless someone remains faithful to it. So you need to have a subjective fidelity. There's no French Revolution if no one is faithful to it, right? It's
there is no subject. There is no subject unless someone remains faithful to any event.
Right. That's right. So, and also no event, right? Because the event is a supernumerary aspect of the things that happened, and so an event requires a subject. Unless the subject is formed, there's no real event. What I like about that is it gets at what I was talking about performance. There's a way in which the person plus the situation makes the object. And so I like Badiou's point about that. And he has this whole tradition of anti-philosophy that he talks about. And anti-philosophers are the ones who recognize this. So in Pascal, unless you're making the wager and believing in Jesus Christ, no event has happened, right? Or Wittgenstein, or Nietzsche is another anti-philosopher, Lacan, St. Paul. He has this list of anti-philosophers who realize that philosophy is about a decision. It's not just about a content. And I find that powerful. I find that very powerful. As for the politics, here's what I would say. Traditionally, the greatest philosophers were politically ambiguous. And they may have had political views, but you didn't need to follow those political views. So you have left and right Hegelians, left and right Nietzscheans, left and right Heideggerians even, Nazi though he is. You have left Heideggerians like Herbert Marcuse. I'm only seeing left Badiouians so far, and that worries me. So in other words, much of the draw of Badiou seems to be people who like his hardcore Maoist leftism, therefore like his philosophy. I think we will know if Badiou is a real great philosopher if you start seeing some right-wing Badiouians, because that would mean that he has ideas that are so valuable that even the right feels the need to pick them up. And I don't know if that's going to happen. As far as triple O, I'm getting all this pressure to come up with a radical critical politics, and I want to resist that. And the reason is, what do people mean today? I don't know about Iran, but in the US, when people say, what are your politics? What they want you to do is to praise some existing form of the hard left, right? Because liberalism and capitalism are very out of fashion in the US right now. The only respectable political position for a philosopher in the US today is some kind of hard left position. Anything else is hard to defend. You know, liberalism is considered to be kind of weak and oppressive. And I don't want to do that. And the reason I don't want to do that is because I tend to think that the left as we know it is thoroughly grounded in German idealism. You know, Marx comes out of Hegel. And so it comes out of too much of an anthropocentric approach, sorry. And I think any politics today worth its salt is going to have to take the climate into account at the center of things, and not just human oppression. The left is mostly interested in human oppression. And if you ask them about the climate, they'll say, oh yeah, that's capitalism. But communism didn't do too much better with the environment. I was in East Germany when it was communist and the environment was horrible. So I think it needs to be rethought from the ground up in an ecological way, which is going to look more like the left than like the right. I don't have any sympathy for the right, but I don't want to be too quick in giving people what they want politically, because that's just doxa, as the Greeks called it. That's just my opinion. Then I have opinions, I vote, right? I've voted for Bernie Sanders 2 times because I think America needs a little more socialism right now, but that's an opinion. It doesn't link directly to OOO. I can't justify Bernie Sanders based on OOO. So I want to go slowly on that. I'm willing to take some criticism by being slow. If that makes sense. Yeah.
Thank you, Ali, for your question. If anybody else has any question, they can chime in.
I actually have a well, more than a question, it's kind of like a semi-question and a semi-comment in some sense. It relates to what Ali was saying, because earlier you spoke about this Eddington's 2 tables, right? So there's the practical table and the table of physics anyway. And it seems to me that it's very strange because I've noticed something about OOO that, of course, there is this distinction between the real and the sensual. And sometimes critics bring up this critique. You know, they say, "Oh, OOO is a two-world theory," whereas in actual fact, oh, sorry.
Can you repeat that last sentence?
Oh yes. Because you know the critique is often raised about say OOO, that it's a two-world theory.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it seems to me that you know this two-world theory is more common with philosophies such as that of Wilfrid Sellars and Eddington himself. You know, so I was wondering because you know in Eddington's example, the practical table seems to be pretty inert. Whereas in your philosophy, the sensual has a very important causal power, if you know what I mean. So I was just wondering what you think about all this.
About the relation between the sensual causal power and the two-world theory critique. Sorry,
and I think the connection's a bit funny.
You can just restate the question.
Is it okay now?
Yeah.
Oh yes. So what I was interested in is this issue of two-world theories, you know, and its connection to what you call ontotaxonomy and the issue of the but the point about the sensual having causal power in your philosophy.
Very good. I think I see 2 questions there, both of them good. By the way, I want to introduce Niki to everybody. Niki Young, I've only known him for 3 years. He's in Malta, but he's one of the world's experts on OOO, along with Professor John Cogburn, who is also here at Louisiana State University, who Erfan knows. So you'll see this guy, Niki, in the future in some context, I'm sure. He'll write a great book about OOO and Derrida, probably.
Thanks.
He's asking about ontotaxonomy, which is a word I used it in my Dante book, Dante's Broken Hammer, and also have written a couple of articles about it. Ontotaxonomy is my name for the assumption that there are 2 kinds of things that exist: human thought and everything else. And it's so improbable. Everything else is being put in the same basket. And then over here, you've got humans who are a very minor species in the universe compared to even how many beetles there are and how many bacteria, viruses, how big and cold the universe is. We might not be that important. Now, people think the human is important because they think the human is our starting point, right? Like Descartes, all we know directly is our experience. But I would say we don't even know our experience that directly. We make deductions about our experience, and we make the same deductions about the outside world. So Kant deduced that time, space, and the 12 categories are who we are. He could make deductions about the inanimate world in the same way. So Onto taxonomy proves that we're not a two-world theory. It's actually the modern philosophers who are two-world theorists by claiming everything's either human or non-human. And as for the sensual causality, yeah, a lot of people claim that since in O everything that's real is withdrawn and it's too deep, nothing can ever happen. But what I say is that nothing happens in the depths. That's right. But things still happen on the surface, right? Because in the surface you have contact between the images of things, and sometimes that contact happens in such a way that there's a retroactive effect on the pieces of the single experience. And so actually we give a lot more justice to the surface than say Deleuze, who calls the surface sterile, right? In Logic of Sense, Deleuze says sterile surface effects. So no, O allows the surface to do all the work actually. Here's the metaphor I came up with recently in a book I'm working on now. People think that O is about a world of static objects where nothing changes. Actually, it's not. It's about a world, you can compare the O world of real objects to a chessboard, where you have this chessboard with pieces on the board that are not moving most of the time. But once in a while, something happens on the level of appearance and change that moves the pieces. And so the movement is intermittent. It happens once in a while. It's not this constant flux like you have in Heraclitus or Bergson or Deleuze or Simondon, these other French. It's that certain things occasionally make things change. A lot of what happens, nothing, there's no effect. History, right? Certain patterns repeat themselves over and over again in history. It takes a real event to change the old patterns so that things don't go in the same circles over and over again. So yeah, I think what you said, Onto taxonomy proves, our critique of Onto taxonomy proves we're not a two-world theory. And the fact that we talk about sensual causality proves that we are not just Platonists. Peter Grattan calls me a Platonist in his book on speculative realism. It's just false. Plato doesn't think the real things can be destroyed. I think they're destroyed all the time. It's just not constant. It's not that every instant they're being destroyed. It's once in a while, like maybe every 5 minutes an object in your room is destroyed. It's not constant. So that's helpful, I hope so.
All right,
Yes,
great.
Thanks.
Mhm.
Does anybody have any questions? No? So.
Frank, can I ask a question?
Oh, yeah, sure, John Cogburn.
Okay. Well, that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you. I'm just taking
Good to
notes
see
like
you.
crazy. I'm trying not to be scattered or go on too long, but I probably will be both. So I think maybe I understand one of my confusions when some of us here read your art book, Christopher Ray Alexander and Michael Harder did a reading group on you this summer, and Mike Ardeline and I are talking about your stuff weekly now.
I've never met Michael. I'm glad to see he's here.
Yeah. So if I could just go back to what I had expected from guerrilla metaphysics, more Ghiasian aesthetics.
You mean art and objects?
I'd expected an aesthetics that was more like Alfonso Lingus. So the reading of Kant would be that, hey, these objects call us to a disinterested pleasure,
right,
that has ramifications. And let me say why I expected that, but I think maybe I figured out why there's a different emphasis, which is what I want to ask you about your theory of metaphor. So, the formalist says that they're skeptical of any content. So an OO theorist could say, you got that almost right, we're skeptical of literal content.
Yes, that's right.
So we have to get to non-literal content. Now, if I go to guerrilla metaphysics, you give two great examples of that. The difference between tragedy and comedy. The literal content is the same, yet we're called by non-literally to respond differently. With tragedy, the appropriate response is solicitude. With comedy, this appropriate response is condescension. So it's this non-cognitive, non-literal content that nonetheless is objective, because it calls us, some things are not funny. Some things are funny and you shouldn't laugh at them for ethical reasons, but some things are funny and some things are tragic. But there's never going to be a theory saying, both of them are just this tension in the sensual. But it's not just a tension in the sensual putting you out into this Kantian indescribability or nothingness or sort of process philosophy blob. It calls on us. And so then you read Kant's ethics that way. So that's the setup. So I think that suggests an Lingisian aesthetics that's tied to ethics in a deeper way, which you kind of articulated here tonight in talking about linguists on the imperative. But it's not a linguistic imperative. It's an imperative when language breaks down for you. But when you talked about metaphor tonight, I wondered if the non-reversibility, but then you talked about the object disappearing, and that brings you to consider the object that's composed of me and the art world, or me and the art object. This new object has its own autonomy, which I think is wonderful. But what I had sort of thought mistakenly was that it was from misremembering guerrilla metaphysics, that it's the sensual object that disappears. And what happens in metaphor is you're getting something about the real object, because the real object is the bearer of the other real object's sensual properties. Mm-hmm. And when that comes into being with the metaphor, you gain this illusion or elusive kind of belief about the real object. And maybe that's what's really going on with beauty. And that's how when you can look at something. I know we've talked about beauty, like Tristan Garcia's account of beauty versus your account of beauty. And Tristan Garcia's account is that it's, sorry, I'm going to go on too long about that. Anyway, so I guess as far as a question, like how much would you want to claim Lingisian aesthetics? Because that's a position I want to attribute to you, but it's not one you develop a lot in the new book. And also, do you think I have to misunderstand your account of metaphor to really push the Lingisian aesthetics? Again, not that the object's disappearing, but it's the real object taking on the sensual. I still get irreversibility and the other things. Anyway, so that's the question.
All right, that's great. The core question here, I guess, is in metaphor or in art more generally, is it the real object that disappears or is it the sensual object that disappears? And there may be some inconsistency between guerrilla metaphysics and art and objects. I have not read guerrilla metaphysics in a long time. I can't stand reading my own books. It drags me down. But maybe I should go back and check that section, because I may have said just what you say. And it sounds like you're reading linguists as are having some sort of direct access or indirect access to the real through ethics. Was I actually talking about Lingisian aesthetics in guerrilla metaphysics?
Oh no, just what you said today about a linguist in response to one of the questions. Yeah. Right.
So yeah, I guess the question would be, do we gain some access to the real through aesthetics? I think that maybe that was my position early, and then I became more skeptical later on as to whether it's possible. And that's what led me to this model that you're building a new object out of the beholder and the qualities. Now, of course, the real object still has to play a role, because the cypress is like a flame. When I perform flame qualities, will be different from saying a cedar tree is like a flame. So somehow the cypress and the cedar still have to be relevant to the metaphor in some way. They can't only vanish, right? They can't only be replaced by me as the performer, because otherwise anything that's like a flame will be the same metaphor, and it's not. So you're right, there has to be some trace of the real object also in the metaphor, which my current theory doesn't allow enough for. It doesn't explain well enough. So yeah, it's also, you notice that art, it sounds like you expected art and objects to be more a complete aesthetic theory, whereas I ended up talking mostly about formalism and what's worth saving in formalism and what's not. So yeah, it's not really an aesthetic theory, it's setting the table for one by talking about the autonomy of the art object and how it has to be modified from the classical autonomy. So it's the object plus maybe a few environing things that are actually part of an extended object. And so in other words, a lot of post-1960s arts can be saved from the damning critique of Greenberg and Fried. Not all of it's good, but some of it is very good. I mean, I think I like Beuys, I like Bruce Nauman. There's a lot of artists I really like. I like some of Warhol. Whereas you shouldn't say those things around Michael Fried. He gets very disgusted. And he still uses the word theatrical as an insult for any art he doesn't like, even though his own work has shown us theatricality is inevitable.
I could just add one more thing. Like, I think it was 2 summers ago, Erfan and I did a reading group together, and we had a great argument about whether beauty was important to aesthetics. And I defended the role of beauty using guerrilla metaphysics.
Okay.
And what you said about comedy, and so I think Erfan was probably happy not to see beauty so much. But look, Erfan, in the complete aesthetics, there may be beauty after all. So
the word beauty has a certain shock value these days in architecture schools too, because people don't like talking about it. It seems like such a naive word, but I like reviving it because I think it refers to something real. I understand why some people don't want to talk about it, so Erfan is excused. I understand his motivations there, but it has a nice punch to it when you use that word in art or architecture schools. There's a kind of feud going on now between SciArc and some of the other architecture schools, especially Princeton, because Princeton, ironically, being this elite white male-dominated university that actually defended the British crown during the American Revolution, it was about as reactionary a place as you can be. Princeton is all for architecture that's political now and it works against oppressing the other. And that's my discussion with Sylvia Levin the other night had touched on that a bit. And then some guy totally trashed me on Twitter because I was asked to write an article on architectural otherness. And I was specifically asked to write about inanimate otherness because they already had about 8 authors talking about human otherness. And so I wrote this article, and this guy that teaches at University of Michigan was trashing me for being an author for white male elite architects, this kind of thing. But I'm going to stick, none of that stuff is important, it is, but I don't think architecture or art deserves to be reduced to defending oppressed groups. There's a lot more going on in reality than oppression. Even human relations are not adequately thematized as forms of oppression. There's a lot more going on when we deal with each other. So, but anyway, that's a live controversy that I'm in right now in the architecture world in particular. That some people think architecture should be about revolution or about saving the poor from their terrible condition. Yeah, there's something to that. And also saving the climate. Some people think architecture is all about saving the climate. Well, designers have a responsibility to have smaller carbon footprints and things, but that still leaves the question of form indeterminate, and form is still important. So I was even criticized for citing Levinas in an article on otherness because there's all these oppressed people I could talk about. Levinas's whole family was executed by the Nazis in Lithuania. I don't know who's more oppressed than Levinas. So that was kind of weird. It's kind of self-congratulatory moralism you get sometimes. Anyway, that was just a kind of appendage to what you said, John. It wasn't your direct question. Had to do with beauty and otherness.
All right. Okay. All right. Thanks so much. Since you mentioned my name a couple of times and
Sure.
you mentioned the revolution as well, so I thought I should chime in here and ask my own question.
Sure.
Since my interpretation of your aesthetics is sort of revolutionary, the way I put it is that I totally agree with you on theatricality, but my interpretation of theatricality is not based on Stanislavski's, but Brecht's. And that led me to create this idea of dialectical immaterialism. Mm-hmm. The way I put it is that we both enter this gold mine from the very same entrance, but there is a maze inside, and they take the left corridor.
Okay.
So that's why it's sort of revolutionary. And for me, there is a beauty, but there is a beauty in the object. And for me, object is that which objects. So there is a beauty in destruction. There is a beauty in revolution for me.
Okay.
So,
there can be.
Yeah. So my question is, are all arts political for you? And what's your take on political art, since you're defending formalism? And formalists, I don't think are very much into. No, they're not. They
don't usually. But I'm a formalist in the new sense, remember, because I don't think the human has to be detached from the art object to have formalism. And there's obviously some political art that's very important or good. I mean, I finally got around 2 years ago to reading Uncle Tom's Cabin, which not everyone likes as literature, but it's the most important work of fiction in American history because it depicted the bad treatment of the slaves, and it helped start the Civil War by showing people in the North how bad slavery really is. So obviously that's a very important work. You could find maybe aesthetically greater works than that are also political in either a good or a bad sense, right? But here's the thing about revolution. Here's why I'm suspicious of it. Because usually the alternative we have is there's either revolution or there's this kind of piecemeal liberal reform that leaves all the oppressive structures in place. So it's one or the other. But actually there's a lot in the middle you can do. Manuel Delanda, who's a leftist, is also not really in favor of revolution. Delanda talks about like a deal with the mesostructure of society, not the macro or the microstructure, but deal with the mesostructure of society. So deal with institutions. Like, we don't need to have a communist people's government in the US necessarily. We can totally restructure the banking system, for example, in a way that is more fair to minorities. Or we can change the way the justices are appointed, since the Republicans are taking advantage of the current system. There are big changes you can make. We can let children start voting. Some people are starting to say children should be able to vote, since our climate decisions are screwing the children. They should be able to vote for the pro-climate change candidate. There are a lot of things you could do that don't involve tearing the United States government down to the foundations and building it up the way Marx and Engels want it, which is, anytime you get rid of the whole history of a thing, I think you're headed for trouble, because some of the things that grow historically grow out of necessity, and they reflect real needs of the people that might not be expressed in prose terms properly. But if you take away all of those, you might be asking for political trouble. You can be asking for a bloodbath. So, but there are things you can do that involve not total revolutionary upheaval of the society, but major restructuring of major institutions in the society that will have real political effects for people and really shift the balance of power. And that's what I think I would focus on doing. It doesn't mean you're just reforming a small law here or a small law there. There are things you can do that are not. See, I think that the idea of total change of everything, revolution, is an idealist position, because there's this idea that the world is somehow, the world as a whole is that which is other from the human. And so therefore we humans can make a plan and totally turn that other thing upside down according to a rational plan, or some kind of plan of equal distribution or fairness. Except we forget that the world outside of the mind isn't a homogeneous lump that can be just turned upside down like that. It has all kinds of connections in it. Famously, even Christianity in Europe didn't eliminate everything pagan, right? We use the Easter bunny for Easter. That's a pagan thing. Our days of the week are pagan names. They're named after the Viking gods. They're not named after Christian figures. So there's always something that survives in the next stage of society. When I was in Egypt they celebrate Shamanism, which is a pagan Egyptian holiday from the Egyptian religion, the beginning of spring. It has nothing to do with Islam. And yet it has survived because somehow it reflects something in Egypt that is real. The feeling that when spring comes, it's a very old, ancient, traditional holiday. So I'm not in favor of tearing down all historically accreted institutions. I don't know if that makes me sound like Edmund Burke or that kind of conservative, but I think that you don't need to go all the way. And sometimes it causes insanity in humans if you tear down all reference points and start them all from scratch. Rational plans don't always work. This is why modernism failed in architecture. This is why they had a postmodern movement in architecture, for better or for worse. That people want to see some of the old forms again. They don't just want to see glass and steel and concrete cubes. They want to see asymmetrical facades, and they want to see winding alleyways that are going mysterious directions, and historical references in some of the buildings. And postmodernism maybe failed in architecture too, but it brought back some ideas that I think were worthwhile. And problems with revolution and with modernism, I agree with Latour's diagnosis of modernity. We've never been modern. The idea that modernity is about creating an artificial split between the world and thought, ontotaxonomy. And that's what revolution is really about. It's the idea that humans can totally free themselves from existing conditions and plan them rationally. I think it's a bad idea. I would focus on a couple of major targets rather than overturning the whole system. So, does that make sense? That's why I'm not a radical, although I'm with the radicals on a number of points. And certainly in a time like this, and after 4 years of Trump, I would like to see a lot more socialism, because capitalism isn't working very well in its current form in the United States. So.
Somebody asked that, can you give examples on contemporary art / meaning now as of the 90s? For example, Documenta 2012, as you wrote for it?
Yeah. Well, I will tell you that I had two favorite works at Documenta. One of them, that was the Documenta 2012. I missed the 2017 one. One of them was that Canadian artist, Jeffrey Farmer is his name, where he took, he cut out all the images of people and objects from Life magazine, this major American magazine that was probably the most read magazine during the middle of the century. I think it exists now again, but it went bankrupt and disappeared. He cut out every human and every object out of every issue of the magazine and put them on popsicle sticks and put them all on this long table. So you're walking down this, I don't know how, it's the length of the whole room, and you're seeing all these people and objects in black and white that were cut out of Life magazine. And what I liked about that, it was a kind of collection. So it performed a sort of organization for us. It created a closed and limited world that we were able to feel a part of. And it also decontextualized those things from their position in the magazine and treated them as autonomous objects. And simply by putting them next to each other, it created new relations between them. And I found that fascinating. A lot of contemporary art is too interested in tearing things down. I like art that reorganizes. And I always think of J.G. Ballard, the British science fiction writer, who said that one of my favorite phrase of his is, the role of the artist has totally reversed today. The role of the artist used to be to create fictions. But now everything's a fiction, right? We have fake news and advertisements, and we're surrounded by fictions. The artist now is supposed to organize a world that makes sense and show you, lead you into this world, and you can make sense of it. I think that's why nonfiction books have become so popular in the United States, more than novels. That's been true for a while now, I think. People like reading a story that has an anchor in reality, isn't just coming from the person's brain. So that's one of the works I like. The other work I liked was done by an Egyptian artist who made a puppet show out of the Crusades. And I'm not sure I can give a theoretical reason why I liked that. But again, it created a credible world. It was anchored in history. It was telling the story of the Crusades. And it's a fairly violent story, of course, but by doing it through puppets, it became less threatening and somehow more intelligible. And it was art. It was really art. I've forgotten the name of this guy. He's from Alexandria, Egypt. And I got a special award of some kind. And I really like that. I also liked another one that was a little more Dada, but I still found it amusing. It was that, what's the name of the German artist? He was going to come to Documenta, Kai something or other. He was going to come to Documenta and then he had to quit. And he wrote Carolyn, the curator, this abject apologetic letter about how, I'm a horrible person, Carolyn. I promised you to come to Documenta and I can't. I just can't get the work done. Well, it goes on like this. I'm a horrible person. I know you will never forgive me for this. And I know I might never have a chance to show it. It goes on and on like this. And Carolyn asked him if she could put that letter in the show as his arts. And so she did. And it was kind of funny. And I don't know what, again, I can't theoretically explain why I like that. But the idea that the refusal, the inability to participate in the Documenta itself became a Documenta artifact. It was somehow very funny. Even if it was maybe somehow predictable as a genre-busting Dadaist technique, it still was done very nicely, I thought. I can't remember the guy's name. He's famous, though. It's K-A-I, I think. Kai something or other. Does that name ring a bell? Some of you might know him. I'll tell you, Kai Althoff, that's it. You know Kai Althoff? He's pretty big in Germany. That was him. Anyway, and then I'll talk about a disappointment I had. I went to the Istanbul Biennale in, I don't remember what year it was, and I didn't like the show. And the reason I didn't like the show is because every artwork was either saying the United States is bad or Israel is bad. It was just purely political statements. Now imagine a right-wing show where every work said the United States is good or Israel is good. Somebody might prefer one or the other based on their political views, right? But aesthetically, they would both fail for the same reason, I think. Because if I want to hear why Israel and the United States are good or bad, I can read a political book, right? Or I can listen to experts talk about problems with American and Israeli foreign policy. I'd rather read a political thing about it. I would learn more. Because all the anti-US and Israel artists are doing is saying what most artists say, right? the most leftist artists are going to agree with him. And so it's not challenging to anybody. It's not really challenging to anyone who goes to the show. There are not going to be too many conservative people going to that show and being shocked by these provocative statements against the United States and Israel. So it's kind of preaching to the choir. It's telling people what they already think they know or what they want to hear. And I think art should do more than that. Art should challenge the way we usually pursue things. And yes, that can be done politically, right? I saw, for example, I toured a very good sculpture program at Virginia Commonwealth University in the United States. And there was an African-American artist who had taken used sheets from a prison. The prison gave him these sheets, and he covered these fake human figures as though they were dead people covered by a sheet, but then he arranged them as if they were on a slave ship, the same kinds of bunks they had on slave ships. So that was very provocative, and it was very political. And it was kind of tying American prisons to slave ships, since there are too many Black people in prisons, and it continues our tradition of a kind of genocide, basically, a kind of low-grade genocide against Black Americans, especially men. And so I found that very provocative because he did it in such a shocking way. And there are other political artworks like that. And you might even enjoy one of those works if you disagreed with the politics. Like, I've not seen any good pro-Trump art. Most of the Trump art I've seen is horrible kitsch. There's this guy in Utah who paints one where Trump is this humble Christian who's looking to the ground and praying. And meanwhile, all the leftist politicians are jumping on the US flag and holding the flag of communism and smiling while they're doing it. So it's just horrible kitsch. I could imagine a possible pro-Trump artwork, even though I hate Trump, that would somehow, I'd say, wow, that's actually pretty good. It's actually a pretty good sculpture of Trump. It's unlikely, but I could imagine it. I can think of other art in the past, Wagner's art. I love Wagner's operas, but he's tied to anti-Semitism and he's tied to German nationalism, which had very scary results, but I still like his music, even though I don't like his politics, and so forth. You can find a lot of, there are authors whose politics you don't like. Heidegger. I don't like Heidegger's politics, of course, but he has some ideas that transcend politics. You don't need to be a Nazi to appreciate the tool analysis of Being in Time. It has nothing to do with Nazism. I get shouted at sometimes for saying this. Some people try to say that every inch of Heidegger is totally contaminated with the swastika. I don't see it that way. Yeah, political art is fine, but the politics needs to be aestheticized. Otherwise, it's not an artwork. So, go ahead.
I have a comment actually about this, because I realized that at least in the local scene, right? I'm from Malta, and then in the local scene, some of the best artists we have, their art proceeds from metaphysics. So it's metaphysics that drives their art. Yeah, I was just thinking about that, because sometimes there is this idea that if art is not political, as I think someone mentioned it earlier, if art is not political, it's not good art, Whereas it's
lost you again, Niki.
It's good art and political. Oh, sorry. Am I okay?
Now you are. Yeah.
Okay. The network's playing up today. I don't know why. Yes, as I was saying, so sometimes there is this idea that good art must make a political claim. Whereas I've noticed that, at least as I said, in the local scene, all the good art proceeds from metaphysics. It's metaphysics that drives their politics. Of course, the art may very well be political, but it's the metaphysics that drives the politics primarily.
Well, that's exceptional. I don't know any other place in the world where it's like that. In the U.S., it's very much politics.
Yeah, I mean, there are other artists I can think of where their art is driven by metaphysics. I mean, I don't know. I would say that Pierre Weig's art is like that, for instance. I recently had the chance to talk about his art, and off the cuff, I can think of him as
Right.
one example.
Right. Okay.
All right, great. I think Christopher has a question, and we can take his question as the last one since we're running out of time. Thank you.
I did, and thank you, Graham. This was a fantastic presentation.
My
I very
first
much
meeting with you.
appreciate it.
Glad to meet you
Yes.
finally.
Good to finally see you. Yes, indeed. Well, I've seen you plenty of times. Actually, one of the questions, or the question that I have to ask you, comes from watching you interact with Zizek. And so while John and I and Michael were all reading through your books this summer, I was always trying to correlate you vis-a-vis, or to triangulate your position vis-a-vis Zizek and Heidegger with respect to one very specific question, which is, for at least the real object, it seems like withdrawal is the fundamental kind of gesture or motion that determines what that object is like. Yeah. And I see other iterations of a similar phenomenon in both Zizek and Heidegger, but it's located in different places. Okay. So as I understand it, the Heideggerian gesture of concealment is interesting because, somewhat like in psychoanalysis, the act of withdrawal itself determines the shape of truth that remains. Okay. And whereas with Zizek, you could almost say, in kind of like using the paradigm of object and world being mutually imbricated, world itself is where the crack is. So okay. Not every, in all these cases, not everything is there. Right. And then the question is, how do we understand the way in which the modality of not everything being there affects what in fact there is? So like, how is it that the object is constituted in some way by the way that withdrawal happens on the part of the real object? Or is it that there's something about the way that all the things are, because all the things in some sense are real objects, that's just never there? And beneath the surface, like, how do you account for that? How would you differentiate yourself vis-a-vis those accounts, I guess? And thank you kindly.
Yeah, right. The first thing I would do is I would not talk about withdrawal as an action. And that's why I've switched from withdrawal to withholding more often. Because what I found is people were when I talked about withdrawal, people are thinking of it as though there's a thing that's present and then for some reason it withdraws. When that's not really what's going on. It's that there's a thing there and it simply has no reason to come to us. Right? Because it can't do that without changing its form. A lot of times I think people think it's easy to take a form from one place and move it to another. I say you can't. I'm like Latour in that sense. So when Meillassoux thinks reality can be mathematized, he claims he's not a Pythagorean, but what he thinks is that there's a horse and I can mathematize the form of the horse and it's somehow the same form. It's in there. Badiou thinks this too, when he talks about arts and logics of worlds. Whereas I say, no, that can't happen. There's no such thing as matter. That Meillassoux thinks the form of the horse in my head is simply put in matter and that makes a horse. But I don't think there is such a thing as matter. I think the idea of matter is posited precisely in order to think that we can extract a thing out of it and bring it to our mind and have perfect knowledge. Instead, I think the form has to be translated. Because what I'm getting when I look at a horse is I'm not getting the horse only. I'm inhabiting the inside of the object that is the horse in me. And then the horse part appears inside that object for me. So that's how I would handle that question. I don't know if that was good enough for you, but that's my basic approach to that question. As for Zizek, the thing is, he's really following Lacan here. And what's the real in Lacan? It doesn't really exist in its own right. It exists only as a failure of the symbolic order. And he calls it enjoyment, right? It's pure surface. It's jouissance. The real is jouissance. So it's not something hidden. It's like, it's not the other in Levinas, it's enjoyment in Levinas. It's the exact opposite. And they use Hegel to justify that too. There's no thing in itself. The thing in itself is simply the thought of a thing in itself for the subject. And so I think Zizek doesn't have enough of a sense of a real. And a lot of Lacanians think shock and trauma are what the real is all about. Even Lee Braver thinks that Kierkegaard is what gives us the real, because some trauma happens or some horrible thing from the outside happens. That's not the real. That's the real as it is correlated with the human. To get the real, you also have to go object, which is what nobody wants to do because no one wants to challenge the sciences on their own terrain. And it's science, and I love science, but I don't think they deserve a monopoly on talking about what happens when two inanimate objects smash together. Philosophy has a different way to talk about that, and I think the same fourfold structure works for that it does for us. Even though I admit humans are different. Lacan has convinced me that the mirror stage may be the best way to differentiate humans from animals. if you find, they're scraps of the mirror stage in animals, but a baby chimpanzee is not as fascinated with its own image as a baby from 6 months to 18 months is. And that's where you get to the imaginary function of the ego. So I think psychoanalysis may be more on the track than ontology of what makes humans different. But I don't think Zizek is, or Lacan for that matter, have a robust enough sense of real outside of the symbolic network. That's what I would say. Did that answer your question?
Well, it does, and in the same breath, it prompts another, which is the one figure that I come out of Spanish literature, and the one figure that looms large in the philosophical picture for me is, and who I'm only beginning to grasp is Zubiri. And I know you're like notoriously, in my mind at least, a person that talks about Zubiri openly, as opposed to kind of like the free-floating acknowledgement of, well, there's one Spanish philosopher from the 20th century that we're willing to talk about.
Right.
Like he just has a different presence within your work that really stands out starkly to me, especially in English language. And so I wondered how his conception of the real fits into the picture that you just painted.
Very interesting. My history with Spanish philosophy is unusual and completely coincidental in one sense. I think I probably would have been captivated by Ortega immediately after reading him, but it might have taken me till age 35 to read him. Instead, what happened is I became interested in philosophy at the age of 16 one night when I read our encyclopedia article at home on philosophy, and I said, oh, this is what I want to do. And so my parents gave me, for Christmas that year, Julian Maria's History of Philosophy, which is available cheaply in a Dover edition in English. And so I read that, and of course, he's making Madrid seem like the center of all philosophical activity of the 20th century, and maybe overstates it a bit, but it's something I wasn't going to get from anybody else. And he speaks so highly of Ortega there that I started buying Ortega's books and reading them, and I love his style, and I love his ideas. And through Ortega, I was led to Zubiri. And it just so happened that Zubiri was available on a clearance sale for like $3 from University of Alabama Press, or no, Catholic University Press. And I on essence really taught me a lot. And most people haven't read Zubiri unless they're into Spanish stuff like you, or in the Spanish speaking world. But Zubiri has a very strong sense of the independence of the real and of its being non-relational. I mean, he also got another book on relations, the dynamic structure of the real, but in all essence, he's very much talking about the non-relational structure of the real. And that's where I got it from, not from Levinas. Because what I was interested in Levinas was the surface, not this otherness. Zubiri is the one who made me think in kind of old Aristotelian terms, that the thing has a nucleus, it's not from its relations. And I think he just excludes too much from the real. Like he says that a farm is not real, a knife is not real, because they require relations. Whereas I think relations can be autonomized, right? Because a car involves relations too, but a car still has an autonomous existence apart from its outward relations. So I thought Zubiri was too traditional on that point, but otherwise he's very powerful, and he's a great reader of Hegel, showing why Hegel doesn't have a strong enough sense of essence. And I wish my Spanish were better so that I could read all that stuff that's not translated, because he's got a lot to say about science. And also there's this new guy, Trias. Do you know Eugenio Trias? Trias, he died a few years ago in Barcelona. And in my journal, Open Philosophy, a Spanish PhD student of mine wrote an article about Tripolo and Trias. And it was all news to me, but he's considered the most important Spanish philosopher since Ortega y Gasset. Zubiri, I think, deserves that title, but they say Trias is very important. And of course, we just don't translate that much Spanish philosophy in the US, right? And so it doesn't get read. It's too bad. It's really too bad. So yeah, my concept of the real owes an awful lot to Zubiri.
Well, I hope that EUP will keep that in mind when they're looking for translators for his work.
Oh, yeah. Sure, if you want to, yeah.
Thank you very much for the response.
Yeah. Sure.
All right, Professor Arman, I'm just wondering if you have time for one more quick
Sure.
question.
I do.
All right, Ali, go ahead.
Thank you so much for the time. Actually, it's not a question, but more of a comment about, since you seem to be still keen on this idea of like the third object between the art object and the beholder and art, and still like, so that making you still holding on to this term theatrical, but at the same time feeling weird about like people like Michael Fried still using it in a pejorative sense.
Right.
But I think after Duchamp, this, because he clearly says art is somewhere always between the beholder and the art object. And I remember once you were quoting from Greenberg in Vancouver that in critique of academic art, him saying that academic art is a type of art not being aware of its own medium. I think the problem with Greenberg is that like he reduces the question of medium to the material medium. So for him, still the object is still a material object. But there is a ready-made discourse out there with people like Dave Beach, for example, if you may know, the British critique, and so they still treat art in a way that they can hold that yes, art is always about something in between the art object and the beholder, without falling into this Platonic dichotomy of the visible world, whereas the knowable world. And for people like Beach, is that like art today, good contemporary art today, similar to the art that you exemplified, like Jeffrey Farmer, I've seen that work, does not entail and does not require too much prolonged time of being looked at, but to be more argued about and written about and talked about. So the discursivity and the argumentation is that what defines the paradigm of art for them. So I think this whole question of whether is there any political art, it could be reduced to the broader question that like, do we still regard art as a priori category or as a paradigmatic category? I think these people treat art as a paradigmatic phenomenon. So as a paradigm that constantly differs from one paradigm to other paradigm, from Duchamp to post-Duchamp, from modern. So there is no such a thing as a priori category. So they constantly define what art is and what it ought to be. So in this way, I think there's a solution to still holding into this account that art object is that third object, without being using the term theatrical and like being subject to the critique of like Plato's critique of theater and the critique of vision. So since you seem to be interested in that, I thought like there are so many artists working in that regard, like Santiago Sierra, Jeffrey Farmer, Garrett James, Cheney Thompson. I think these are still highly politicized artists who do not yet believe in such a thing as political art. They say there is such a thing as contemporary art, which might ontologically be about politics, but still they don't call it political art because they feel that this is a new paradigm of art, which yet it has to be subject to a different change and a different paradigm that is yet to come. Sorry, and thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I have anything to say in response to that, but you said it's art that doesn't require too much time and can be argued about, which sounds kind of like.
Sorry, it does not require too much time to be looked at, but too much time to be argued about.
Right, that's what I meant. That's what I meant. Which sounds kind of like a Duchampian argument, right? That he didn't like retinal arts. Art is supposed to make you think.
Exactly.
And that's fine. I don't have any objection to that, but I don't think art has to make you think. I think there's levels of cognition that don't involve thinking, but involve something maybe even more primordial. I don't know. So again, I don't have anything against conceptual art per se. I did kind of enjoy the kinetic experience of doing the walking down Farmer's images. Yes, you could have just read about it as a conceptual piece. Like imagine cutting all the images out of life and putting them down a table. But actually the kinetic experience of walking and looking and feeling how long it is added something to the experience for me, more than it would have been purely conceptual. I don't know. All right. I enjoyed this very much. One of these days, I'm going to make it to Iran. This is my second or third lecture there on the internet. Never been there. One of these days, I want to make it.
Would love to have you here.
That'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would demand to see a lot of architecture if I come.
Yeah, there are some.
Yeah.
Not destroyed yet, but there are some.
And I want to see the architecture in Isfahan and places like that. There's so many sites in Iran I'd love to see.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a gorgeous
place. One more quick thing. You mentioned that architecture for you is this ideal contemporary form. There's this person, you might be familiar with Gordon Motta-Clark. Yeah, he exactly as you said, he was like, he turned the Sullivan's statement that art follows function to art follows function. And he coined this term anarchitecture, which he defined it as making without building. And so I think it's right up your alley. Like it's exactly the type of artist that still treats the question of form and function without that like traditional, like conservative way of like what is form. And he holds the account of like, formalizing art rather than formalist art. So I thought, yeah, that might be something relevant as well.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'm familiar with Gordon Marta Clark. Yep.
All right. Thank you all for participating to this lecture, and thanks Graham Harman for this amazing talk.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, really appreciate it, and I personally really loved this meeting.
Thanks again for arranging it, and thanks for those who are awake at 2 o'clock in the morning. It's only midnight here in the West Coast. I think John and Christopher have 2 a.m. if I'm right. Christopher may even have 3 a.m. depending on where exactly he is. But anyway, thank you all.
Thank you, everybody, and happy Halloween.
Yeah, it's Halloween here now, after midnight. All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.